All right, guys, so now we're going to talk about organic chemistry. For something to be organic, that means not only does it have carbon in it, but that it has carbons attached to other carbons, and also usually carbons attached to hydrogen atoms. So you can see in these fatty acid chains that there are several carbons attached to each other, and also there are carbons connected up by covalent bonds to hydrogen atoms. Carbons connected to other carbons, and hydrogens connected to hydrogens. So it makes or hydrogens connected to carbon. That's what makes an organic molecule be an organic molecule. You might wonder why all organic chemistry is centered around the carbon atom. And there's several important reasons for that. One of those is that carbon is a really, really small atom. If you look up at the periodic table, carbon is element number 6, which means it's the 6th smallest of all the elements. Typically, it's going to form covalent bonds. What that means is that the shared electrons that carbon is going to share with other atoms are going to be very near to the nucleus of the carbon atom, where the protons are, which means they're very strongly held onto. The bond is very, very strong. So because it's a small atom, carbon forms really strong covalent bonds. That makes it a good building material because it can make compounds that are very hard to break. Also, carbon is in column 4 of the periodic table, or column 14, depending on how you think about it, which means it has 4 valence electrons. We know that when bonds are made, especially covalent bonds in this case, electrons get shared until they get up to that magic number of 8, the octet rule. So carbon can make 4 bonds at one time. It can bind to 4 different things at one time, or it can form double and triple bonds with molecules as well. That allows carbon to make molecules that come in many, many shapes. And we know from our discussions in class that shape determines function, structure determines function. So carbon can make molecules that come in many, many shapes, and therefore many, many, many functions. Every living thing that we know of on Earth today is centered around carbon, largely because of these properties that we just mentioned. Even though carbon is the center of organic chemistry, just carbons connected to carbons and carbons connected to hydrogens, that's sort of boring. And it doesn't give the molecules all the functionality that they need. So oftentimes in organic chemistry, there are other groups of atoms that are added to carbon chains that change the properties of the molecule. These groups of atoms that can be added to a carbon chain and therefore change its properties are known as functional groups. And we're going to look at several examples of functional groups. There's about 4 of these in this table that I really want you to know. The most basic functional group, or one of the most basic functional groups, is called the hydroxyl group. And that is simply an oxygen and a hydrogen atom. The R in all these diagrams, that stands for the carbon and hydrogen chain, the remainder of the molecule, which is carbons and hydrogens. The functional group OH is called a hydroxyl group, or sometimes it's called an alcohol group. It's found in a lot of things like amino acids, nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA and RNA. It's also found in a lot of sugars, like glucose, for example. But what it does to a carbon chain, since it has oxygen in it, an electronegative element, connected up to hydrogen, which isn't very electronegative, it makes the molecules that contain this particular functional group polar. And because they're polar, it allows them to form hydrogen bonds and link to other molecules. We'll talk more about hydrogen bonds in the days to come. But what you need to know about hydroxyl groups is that molecules they're attached to become polar and form hydrogen bonds, largely because of this very electronegative oxygen atom contained inside. A carboxyl group is another one that you need to know. Sometimes it's called an acid group. It consists of a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and single bonded to an OH. This particular group, this carboxyl group, is found in many fats, and also it's found in amino acids. It's why an amino acid is an acid. This H will oftentimes break away and be given off as a proton. And we know that's what acids do, they give off protons. But since it has a lot of oxygen in it, it also causes molecules to be polar. And we said before that hydrogen can come off. So in addition can make molecules be somewhat acidic. Another really important one for you to be familiar with is the amino group. Amino refers to nitrogen. So the amino group is a nitrogen-containing functional group. It's a nitrogen atom covalently bonded to two hydrogens. And then that's connected up to the hydrogen, or the carbon chain, rather. Nitrogen is also one of those elements up in the top right of the periodic table that's electronegative. So again, having an amino group can cause molecules to be polar. It can cause them to form hydrogen bonds. And another important part of this amino group is this nitrogen-containing amino group can take in another proton, another H+. Therefore, it's sometimes said to make molecules be acidic. The amino group is obviously found in amino acids, also proteins. A fourth group is the sulfhydryl group. This one we're probably going to only talk about being in one place. It's simply a sulfur atom combined with a hydrogen atom. Where it's found and where we're going to talk about its importance is in proteins and amino acids. This group, this SH group, causes certain amino acids to be able to form disulfide bonds. And these help to hold the structure of a protein in place so that it can maintain its function. The final functional group we'll mention is the phosphate group. The phosphate group is a fairly big group. It consists of a phosphorus atom surrounded by some oxygens and also some hydroxyls, some OH groups. It's found in a lot of different biological molecules. We've talked about phospholipids, we've talked about nucleotides and nucleic acids. But the phosphate group, because of those oxygens, tends to make molecules polar. And because these hydrogens can be released and given off as protons, it can also cause molecules that contain them to be acidic. So again, these are all functional groups. They're groups of atoms that are attached to a carbon chain that change the properties of the carbon chain. Another thing we want to mention here are two kinds of reactions that are really important in organic chemistry. Most organic molecules are large molecules, what we might call macromolecules or polymers. They're made of repeating pieces that are hooked together. Think of a chain of Legos as being a macromolecule and each Lego being a monomer. So the polymer is the whole chain of Legos and each individual Lego is a monomer. In this case, we see two monomers. And what we're trying to do in this particular example is hook them together to make a polymer. Notice what happens is the hydroxyl group from this monomer and the hydrogen from that monomer come off. They free up a bind site on here and here. And this OH and H come together to make water. But the most important thing is that the two monomers now bind where that OH and H were. That type of reaction in which monomers are put together to make polymers are called condensation reactions. Sometimes we might also call them synthesis reactions. So condensation or synthesis reactions bind together monomers in the process of trying to build a polymer. They're called condensation reactions because they tend to release water because it's broken off from the molecules in order to free up those bind sites. Sort of the opposite of a condensation reaction is what we see over here. In this case, we're starting with the polymer. We add in water as a reactant, and the water helps to split apart this bind right here. That type of reaction is called hydrolysis. So hydrolysis reactions take a polymer, split a bind between two monomers, and break that polymer into its component monomer parts. Hydrolysis, break apart. Condensation, put together. Those are two very important terms that you need to be familiar with. In this particular unit, we're going to talk about what are called the biological macromolecules, or we might say the four major groups of biochemicals. Carbohydrates, better known to most of you as sugars, starches and things like that. Lipids, which are things like fats and oils, and waxes, and also steroids. I ran out of space there. proteins, which are just that, they're proteins, but we know they're probably the most important chemicals in our body, at least in terms of functionality. They make up our body, they make up our enzymes, they make us do what we're able to do. And then nucleic acids, those are things like DNA, ATP, and RNA, plus some other examples that we'll talk about later. These molecules are the four major groups of organic macromolecules. They make us work. Today we're going to talk about two of them, carbohydrates and lipids. Carbohydrates are better known to most people as sugars. Their general formula for at least a monosaccharide, the most simple sugars, are CN, H2N, ON. What that means, for example, if there were 6 carbons, there would be twice as many hydrogens, 12, and the same number of oxygens. So it would be C6H12O6. That's the formula we know for glucose. But if we had 3 carbons, it would be C3H6O3. It's the general formula for what's called a monosaccharide. In our bodies, carbohydrates have numerous uses, but the most important ones, they're used to give us a quick source of energy, and they're also used to build things. For example, cell walls in plants are made mostly out of a carbohydrate called cellulose. Exoskeletons in insects are made mostly out of a carbohydrate known as chitin. We're going to talk about several kinds of sugars and carbohydrates. We'll start with the simple ones, which are sometimes called monosaccharides, which means one sugar. You're familiar with several monosaccharides. Probably the one you've heard the most about is glucose. Obviously, that's made during photosynthesis. A very similar compound, fructose, and also galactose. It turns out all 3 of these molecules, glucose, fructose, and galactose, have the same molecular formula. What's different between the 3 of them is the way those carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens are hooked together. They're made of the same pieces, put together in a different arrangement. And we know the whole structure-function idea. Different structure means slightly different function. These things are called structural isomers of each other. They're made of the same pieces, but they're hooked together in different ways, structural isomers. But again, they're called simple sugars. A couple other examples of simple sugars that you're probably familiar with are ribose, which is found in RNA, and deoxyribose, which you guys should know is the sugar found in DNA. Also sometimes categorized as simple sugars is a group of molecules known as the disaccharides. And these are 2 of the monosaccharides that have been bonded together by condensation or synthesis reactions. And there's several examples of those you should be familiar with. For example, sucrose, better known to most of us as table sugar. This is the sugar that we used in the lab the other day. Sucrose is a glucose molecule that's been bonded to a fructose molecule. So it's a little bit bigger sugar. Maltose, which is found in like malted milk balls and malt liquor, are 2 glucoses hooked together by a condensation reaction. Lactose, milk sugar, is a glucose connected to a galactose. We know there are a lot of people on Earth today that are lactose intolerant. And that means they're missing a set of enzymes that allow them to digest lactose. If they happen to eat lactose, that lactose ends up undigested in their large intestine. There are a lot of bacteria in that large intestine, and they will begin to digest the lactose. That generates a lot of gas. And people who are lactose intolerant become bloated, become sick at their stomach, they may get diarrhea. From what I've heard, it's not a very pleasant experience to be lactose intolerant. Here's some pictures of some simple sugars. Glucose over here on your left, fructose on your right. Notice they tend to form rings. If you went through and counted molecules, you would count 6 carbons in both of these pictures. You would count 12 hydrogens in both pictures and 6 oxygens in both pictures. They're both C6H12O6. But again, because they're made of the same atoms, but in a different order, they're called structural isomers of each other. In biology, if you see rings of carbons, typically, in most cases, those are going to be carbohydrates of some form or other. This is showing you glucose being combined with glucose through a condensation reaction to make maltose. So monosaccharide plus monosaccharide yields a disaccharide. Water is given off as a waste product because it's condensation. We're putting things together, going left to right. Now we also could go right to left, and in that case we take a disaccharide and we break this bind, giving off two monosaccharides. Going from right to left, this is called hydrolysis. We're using water to help us split, in this case, a sugar. The bigger, more complicated sugars, or what we call the complex carbohydrates, are sometimes called polysaccharides. And this means many sugars. Your diet should be mostly made of polysaccharides. Somewhere around 70% or so of your diet is going to be this. Mostly it's going to be starch, but there's also going to be some cellulose and some other polysaccharides inside your diet, inside that 70%. Polysaccharides are polymers of monosaccharides. So they're simple sugars hooked together over and over and over and over again. Starch is by far the most important example that we'll talk about in this class. Starch is a polymer of glucose. It's made of many, many glucoses hooked together in a certain arrangement. In nature, starch is mostly made by plants and other photosynthesizing organisms. Its function in the plant is to store extra energy for later. For example, a potato is a energy storage structure for the potato plant. An ear of corn. What we're eating are the seeds from the corn plant. And those seeds are loaded with starch. That starch is there to feed that baby plant until it can do photosynthesis of its own. Another important polysaccharide is glycogen. It too is a polysaccharide made of glucose monomers. The difference between starch and glycogen is that those glucose molecules are put together in a different arrangement. The whole structure-function argument again. Starch tends to be made by plants, whereas glycogen tends to be made by animals. It's the way we store extra energy, at least extra short-term energy. We tend to store glycogen in our liver and also in our muscles. We can only store so much. So if we have extra energy beyond our glycogen storage ability, we tend then to store it as fat. Sometimes, though, glycogen is referred to as animal starch because they have very similar functions. Starch in plants, glycogen in animals. Another important polysaccharide is cellulose. Cellulose is also made by plants. It's also made of glucose, but again, hooked together in a different way. Cellulose is hooked, the glucoses in cellulose are hooked together in such a way that it's very hard to break them apart. It's hard to hydrolyze cellulose. So cellulose is often used to make things like cell walls. Wood is largely made of cellulose. It's hard for animals like us to digest. When you eat cellulose, most of it just goes straight through you. It's very hard to break down. A final polysaccharide that we'll mention is chitin. Chitin is very similar in structure to the other polysaccharides we just mentioned. It has some nitrogen groups in it that the other ones don't, but it's found in the exoskeletons of insects. It's also found in the cell walls of fungi. So when you eat mushrooms, you're eating chitin. Here's some pictures. This is supposed to show you starch. Each one of these rings represents a glucose molecule. These are hooked together in a pattern that's fairly easy for most organisms to digest. Another name for starch is amylose. And we've talked about in class already that in our saliva and also in our intestines, we're going to find an enzyme called amylase, which will help us digest the starch and break it into monosaccharides. Here's glycogen. Notice the structure is similar. It's still made of repeating glucose molecules hooked together, but they're put together in a slightly different structure. And remember, this is stored in animal livers and also animal muscles, and it's a way to store energy for use later. Here's cellulose. Notice that not only are glucoses connected together side by side, but between the different chains, the glucoses form hydrogen bonds with each other. These bonds that I'm circling make the cellulose molecule really, really hard to break. And this is why it's good for making up things like cell walls and wood. Very strong, very hard to break down. The last thing we'll talk about today are lipids. Lipids, like the sugars, are mostly made of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. It's kind of a diverse group. The one thing the lipids all have in common is that they don't like water. They're insoluble in water. And that's because mostly they're made of carbons and hydrogens. They've got a few oxygens in there, but mostly carbons and hydrogens. By themselves, carbons and hydrogens are going to make molecules that are non-polar and therefore hydrophobic, not liking water. Lipids are a pretty diverse group, as I said before. They make up not only fats, which tend to be solid at room temperature, oils, which tend to be liquids at room temperature, waxes, like beeswax, phospholipids, which we know are found in our cell membranes, and also steroids, things like testosterone and estrogen and cholesterol. The most important use for lipids in our body is long-term energy storage. When we talk about fat, we're talking about long-term energy storage. And the type of lipid that does that is what we might call a fat or a triglyceride. And I want to go to a picture to talk about a triglyceride. A triglyceride looks sort of like this. It's built around a 3-carbon molecule called glycerol, attached up to 3 long chains of carbons and hydrogens. These 3 long chains are called fatty acids. So here is a triglyceride, 3 fatty acids connected up to glycerol. This thing can store huge amounts of energy, largely because in a molecule, energy is stored in bonds. And there's a lot of bonds here to store energy. It turns out that lipids are so energy rich that per gram, they contain about twice as much energy as either carbs or proteins. Another thing I'll mention here is, why do we get fat? Our bodies are fairly conservative by nature. So if you you eat more energy than you need in a day, your body's not going to waste it. It's going to try to store it. And the way our bodies store extra energy is as fat. So if we take in more calories than we use, we're going to gain weight. The last thing I'll mention for today are the differences between what we call saturated fats and unsaturated fats. The word saturated means full. So I'm going to go to a picture here to show you something. This is supposed to be a section of a fatty acid chain. Notice that all these carbons are bound to 4 different atoms. That's the maximum. They're full. They're bound to the maximum amount of different things that they can, which is 4. On the other hand, this bind right here, these 2 carbons are only bound to 3 things, and they share a double bind in the middle. So the basic difference on a chemical level, saturated binds contain only single binds between carbons and hydrogens, where unsaturated fatty acids have some double binds between carbons. That doesn't sound all that important. But what it causes to happen is this. When you have saturated fats, because we just have straight chains of single binds, all the fatty acid chains are nice and straight, and they fit very closely together. Because they fit so closely together, they're pretty dense, and therefore they're usually solids at room temperature. Whereas whenever you have these double binds, like we see here and here, that causes the fatty acid chains to bend, to twist, to kink. And because they're bended and twisted, when you put these in a container, they get further apart. and therefore they're typically liquids at room temperature. So these are what we might call our oils, and these down here we often would just call fats. In terms of how that matters for your health, typically speaking, saturated fats usually come from animal products. And of the fats that we eat, they're the worst for us because they tend to cause buildup of plaques, fat buildups, in a particular set of arteries in our body called the coronary arteries. This is a term you need to know. The coronary arteries are the arteries that give oxygen and nutrients to your heart muscle itself. So if those vessels, the coronary arteries, get clogged, you have a heart attack. And your heart muscle is basically being deprived of oxygen and also of nutrients. Unsaturated fats, on the other hand, are not all that bad for you, at least in moderation. And they usually come from plants. They're going to be more oily in nature, your vegetable oils. One other thing I'll mention that we've already talked about before, the phospholipids, we know make up our cell membranes. And we know they're built around glycerol, connected to two long fatty acid chains. This is mostly non-polar. And then up here we have this phosphate group along with some nitrogen-containing groups. This side is polar. Because phospholipids have a polar and a non-polar side, we've talked about this term over and over again. They're said to be antipathic. They have both a polar and non-polar side. And because of that part of their nature, when we put them in solution, they end up forming the phospholipid bilayer, which is the conserved membrane found in every living thing that we know of on Earth today. I think that's a good place to stop. I'll see you guys tomorrow.